got to get to the airport.
I'm going to call back to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology and welcome our witnesses this morning, or now this afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making the extra effort to be here from Europe and back. And so we will start. Let's start with, I believe we'll just go left to right with Mr. Turner. We appreciate your willingness to come and testify. Mr. Turner, if you want to go ahead and start, Research Director for Free Press. We welcome you here, and we look forward to your testimony, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the committee. On behalf of Free Press and the Free Press Action Fund, as the coordinator of the Save the Internet Coalition, representing more than 800 groups and their 10 million members, I appreciate the opportunity to offer the perspective of Internet users in today's hearing on House Joint Resolution 37. Let me begin by acknowledging an often forgotten truth. The principle of non-discrimination, which is the bedrock of net neutrality policy, was not always the political football it is today. Unfortunately, the debate around non-discrimination has become immune to the calming powers of historical fact and susceptible to the ills of special interest politics and false partisan frames. This recent rhetorical drift is very much at odds with the long bipartisan effort to prevent market power abuses by owners of our nation's critical communications infrastructure. It was the Nixon administration that put in place strong rules of non-discrimination in order to ensure abuses of market power would not stifle the growth of an infant network computing industry. And this successful framework was later improved upon by both the Carter and Reagan administrations. In the Telecom Act of 1996, a bipartisan Congress recognized that in order to foster new industries, we needed the FCC to act to ensure that everyone had open access to the information superhighway. Look no further than Section 10 to see that Congress intended non-discrimination survive any deregulation. In the early 2000s, the FCC began to abandon the Telecom Act's blueprint for reasoned deregulation through forbearance. However, the Commission still recognized that the underlying non-discriminatory outcomes were worth preserving. FCC Chairman Michael Powell first articulated the 4 Internet freedoms that subsequently served as the basis for the open Internet provisions in the COPE Act, adopted by the House in 2006. And Chairman Kevin Martin took action in 2008 to stop Comcast's secret discrimination against certain Internet content. But recently, we've seen this debate move away from the shared goal of preserving the open Internet. The problem of market power in communications networks is very real and increasingly politically inconvenient. As a result, we've seen those who used to recognize this problem abandon those views. Some policymakers now seem resigned to the misguided notion that the duopoly Internet access market is perfectly competitive. This is unfortunate because I believe we all agree that the Internet should be preserved as an open platform. Allowing gatekeepers to erect barriers to speech and commerce is an unacceptable outcome, and public policy should be used to prevent it. If we can agree that ensuring access to an open platform is a worthy policy goal, then we have a duty to confront the reality that network owners have strong incentives to close the platform and favor their own content at the expense of everyone else's. Now, I recognize that some of you are uncomfortable with the FCC's open Internet order. My organization, too, ultimately opposed it. We felt that it failed to adequately preserve and protect the open Internet. However, we oppose the resolution of disapproval. It will leave consumers completely unprotected. It will remove the limited certainty that the FCC's rules provide. And most importantly, it will prevent the FCC from addressing blatant censorship and anti-competitive activities in the future. This resolution is an unnecessary and dangerous overreaction to a policy framework that is at its core very similar to the bipartisan COPE Act of 2006. And make no mistake, adoption of this resolution will increase market uncertainty and harm economic growth. Most ISPs have told Wall Street the truth, that these rules are no burden. So to borrow a very tired old phrase, the resolution of disapproval is a solution in search of a problem. Innovators in the applications and content sector believe they now have a certain, albeit imperfect, framework to live under. This resolution, if enacted, will remove that certainty and subject them to the discriminatory whims of the ISPs. There may be much to dislike about what this FCC did and how it did it. But the fundamental point here is that we cannot simply set up a false choice between what the FCC did and no policy at all. We can't wish away the concentrated market structure. We can't simply hope that the duopoly ISPs will make decisions in the best interest of all Americans. I am a strong believer in free markets, But I understand the immovable barriers to effective competition in markets like this that have natural monopoly characteristics. Internet users cannot afford for Congress to remove what little oversight is left. So instead of pursuing this perilous path, we urge this body to remember its commitment to protecting non-discrimination and work on constructive solutions that will benefit all Americans. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Turner, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your testimony. Ms. Chase, we welcome you to the subcommittee. We appreciate your testimony as well and your extra effort to be here today. Please go ahead.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the importance of network neutrality rules to job creation, economic development, and innovation. I'm founder of GoLoco, an on-ride ride-sharing community, the founder of Meadow Networks, a consulting firm that advises governments about wireless applications in the transportation sector, and the founder and former CEO of Zipcar, the world's largest car-sharing company. When I received the invitation late last week to testify before this committee, I was working across the Atlantic, and later this afternoon I'll fly back. Despite the significant resources and travel times to come here, I accepted the invitation because the course of action Congress is considering, namely repealing and eliminating the authority of the FCC to enact policies that preserve an open internet, will greatly harm our country's ability to innovate, produce jobs, and remain globally competitive. And as a successful American entrepreneur, I care deeply about maintaining our leadership within the world marketplace. 11 years ago, I co-founded Zipcar. Our innovation was to make renting a car as simple as getting cash from an ATM, and open access to the internet was central to Zipcar's success. It is only because of the ease, speed, and zero marginal cost of finding, reserving, and unlocking a car that anyone would be willing to rent a car for an hour or to sell only an hour's car's time. Without an open internet facilitating these transactions, Zipcar would simply not exist. Eliminating the FCC's network's neutrality rules will put future entrepreneurs and small businesses at a significant disadvantage. Network neutrality prevents the telecommunications industry from discriminating against new applications and supports innovative new services like Zipcar. I want to draw an important parallel. Imagine, for example, if Zipcar had been forced to rely on the auto industry's definitions of car ownership, or worse yet, had to ask their permission to exist. Our vision of a fleet of cars being shared among a community of individuals would have been seen as implausible and threatening. Likewise, we cannot rely on the telecommunications industry to define the internet or what people may use it for. Without consumer protections like network neutrality, these companies will define the internet to mirror their preferred triple play, their telephone services, their video channels, and their notion of the ideal internet experience. And they will seek to squash any service that threatens their revenue stream, a perfect recipe for stifling innovation. This is not just mere speculation about the potential for short-sightedness, but rather personal first-hand experience. During the initial years of Zipcar, the wireless industry was simply unable to think outside the box. When we first approached cell phone companies to buy a data plan access in 2000, we were met with blank, non-responsive stares. The industry had only one vision of wireless at that time, and therefore only one product to sell. I recall many representatives not actually understanding the difference between purchasing kilobytes versus purchasing minutes. In their minds, their customers all used cell phones. Others simply did not exist. Today, innovation is the lifeblood of a competitive economy, and the internet is its circulatory system. An open internet gives everyone both access and the ability to apply new ways of thinking to problems. An open internet breaks through silos that often do not get new thinking applied to them. For entrepreneurs, the open internet allows for extraordinarily low input costs, which allows them to efficiently tap into unused excess capacity and leverage ideas at virtually no cost. Ensuring that the internet will continue to promote innovation is the reason we're having this debate. And I absolutely agree that excessive regulation stifles innovation and prevents free markets from innovating. But the most important thing I have to say to this committee, and the reason I'm here and thrown all this way, the protections enacted by the FCC will help ensure an open internet. Network neutrality is not excessive regulation that will stifle innovation. Network neutrality promotes innovation and protects consumers by preventing telecommunications companies from stifling new thinking, new services, and new applications. Indeed, I think the FCC's rules actually did not go far enough, especially with respect to wireless. The idea that different rules should apply and that my experience of the internet would be different depending on whether I'm sitting at home at my desk connected or on a park bench accessing those same pages wirelessly is nonsense. This arbitrary distinctions dramatically complicate the life for innovators and entrepreneurs who will now have to contend with two different internets, one wireless and one wireline, in everything they do. If Congress wants to truly unlock economic and job-creating potential of the Internet and fully tap into the innovation potential of our country, it should do so by improving the FCC's rule in this regard, not repealing it. 20 years ago, no one was thinking that the Internet would be used to share small numbers of cars among large numbers of people. And I don't know what brilliant and unexpected uses the Internet will enable tomorrow. No one here does. That is why it's critical that fundamental characteristics of the Internet, its ability to accommodate, adapt, and evolve, is protected from companies that want to control how entrepreneurs and the general public uses their networks. Public policies to ensure this outcome are vital if America wants to remain competitive in the 21st century economy. Protecting the open Internet and preventing an oligopoly from controlling how entrepreneurs like me use the Internet is in America's best interests. Thank you for letting me testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chase, again for your testimony. And now let's go to Mr. Cicconi. Thank you for being here from AT&T, Senior Executive Vice President, External and Legislative Affairs. We welcome your testimony, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on behalf of my company, AT&T. I recognize it's unusual to be asked to testify on a resolution on which we've not taken a position. However, as I'm sure all of you know, we've been involved for years in the issue that underlies HJRES 37, and that is the protracted dispute over net neutrality regulation by the FCC. Let me first stress that AT&T has long supported the broadband principles laid out by the FCC over 6 years ago. We support an open Internet. We've promised to abide by that concept voluntarily. But like many issues that start from a shared belief, this debate long ago devolved into a long discussion over specifics, whether the FCC should be able to enforce the broadband principles, whether a broad set of rules was needed, what legal authority the FCC has to put such rules in place, and all of this despite any real evidence of a problem. As in most regulatory debates, this one has not lacked for radical voices. Many sought heavy-handed government regulation and control of free markets, some for commercial advantages, others to advance their own ideology. Since this debate began back in 2005, AT&T has consistently opposed any FCC regulation of Internet services or facilities. This is still our strong preference today. We feel the antitrust laws, the Federal Trade Act, and the discipline of highly competitive markets are more than adequate to police any potential abuses. Nonetheless, the pressure for Internet regulation continued over the years. You've all heard the saying that there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Unfortunately, this is sometimes also true of a bad idea. And the versions of net neutrality put forth by our opponents were in many cases truly bad and truly radical ideas. In October of 2009, some of these bad ideas found their way into a proposed net neutrality rule at the FCC. AT&T and the entire industry strongly opposed this proposal. It created a high degree of market concern and, needless to say, a very bad climate for investment. Unfortunately, in the spring of 2010, the situation went from bad to worse. Following a decision by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that questioned the FCC's legal authority to enforce its broadband principles, the Commission reacted by proposing to subject all broadband facilities to common carriage regulation under Title II of the Communications Act. This proposal was both extreme and without foundation in law, we feel strongly, and we fought it vigorously. Again, this even more radical proposal upset the financial markets in a very delicate economic situation. By the summer of last year, and after hearing from a bipartisan majority of House and Senate members, Chairman Janikowski, to his credit, began seeking a different approach. Discussions began between the opposing sides. AT&T participated because, quite frankly, we felt the issue was on a dangerous path that could end very badly for our company and for the industry. This process was long, hard, contentious. It led ultimately to discussions last fall under the auspices of Chairman Waxman, and a compromise with which, like most compromises, no one was entirely happy, but most participants felt to be fair. However, legislation proved impossible in that short time frame, and the FCC made clear its intentions to move forward with a vote on net neutrality regulations by year end. In this situation, my company faced a difficult decision, given that the only proposals currently before the FCC were either bad or worse in our view. With others in the industry, we decided we'd be willing to accept a rule modeled on the compromise we reached in the Waxman process, but we were unwilling to support anything that went beyond that. Chairman Janikowski, I might add, was under tremendous pressure from others, including voices on the Commission, to impose Title II regulations. Instead, he and his staff worked with the industry in good faith and with the various stakeholders to craft a compromise rule that tried to balance major differences while avoiding more extreme proposals. I would be the first to stress this is not a perfect solution. Our preference has always been that the FCC should not regulate in the Internet space. But it was also clear to us that a majority of the FCC was determined to move forward in December, and that we would not be representing our shareholders well if we let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We faced opponents pressing for more extreme regulations and knew that absent a fair middle ground, a good bit of harm might be done to our industry and to needed investment. Chairman Janikowski resisted those pressures and acted in good faith to find that fair middle ground. The rule is consistent with AT&T's current open Internet policies. It would not require us to change any of our business practices or plans, assuming it is applied in a reasonable, narrowly tailored way. And as the chairman of AT&T has said, it provides a path for continued investment by removing much of the uncertainty this issue has caused. It was a factor, along with recent tax law changes, in AT&T's decision to accelerate the investment in the build-out of our LTE wireless network. In short, we believe the result, given the alternatives before the Commission, is both fair and will help maintain our company's ability to invest. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cicconi. We appreciate your testimony. And now we're going to go to Dr. Anna Maria Kovacs with Strategic Choices. We appreciate your willingness to come and testify on the financial implications of this rule in the markets. Thank you. Go ahead. Please pull that microphone close and make sure it's turned on.
Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I spent roughly 25 years working as an investment analyst covering the communications industry before retiring as an analyst at the end of 2010. While I intend in the future to work as a consultant at the present time, I have no clients and I represent myself. The Internet has become central to the lives of most Americans, and it is certainly something I rely on almost every day for news, information, and communications. I agree with the stated goals of the FCC's order, the desire for an open Internet, for transparency, for an environment in which innovation and investment flourish to the benefit of both consumers and providers at all levels of the Internet ecosystem. I am concerned, however, that some aspects of the order will ultimately result in unintended but nevertheless detrimental consequences to investment and innovation, both at the edge and the core. And I think it's important to emphasize that the debate is not about whether blocking or degradation of service are good or bad. It is about whether they are more likely to occur through the intentional actions of broadband Internet access providers or through lack of investment. That's really what the debate boils down to. The order appears to be premised on the view of the Internet ecosystem that assumes that the edge is embryonic and innovative and the core is mature and static. Application providers, including content and service providers, are left free to transform their business plans at will. One of their key inputs, transport, is provided to them free over the networks of broadband Internet access providers, carriers with whom they may compete at the application level. Conversely, the order restricts the carriers' flexibility in designing their business plans, limits their sources of revenue, dictates that they spend capital to expand the networks at the edge providers' will, and forces them to subsidize competitors who cannibalize their customer base. To characterize this as a transfer of wealth from broadband Internet access providers to application providers is accurate, but does not begin to grasp the problem for both parties. A transfer of wealth between two independent parties can be beneficial to one at the expense of the other. A transfer of wealth that will ultimately cripple the party on which the other relies for its very existence is profoundly harmful to both. Thus, it is the order's implicit assumption that it is possible to protect the edge at the expense of the core that concerns me most. The two are inextricably entwined. To protect the edge, it is vital to protect the core. Far more devastating to Google, Skype, and Netflix than being charged for transport is an internet whose evolution and capacity are flash frozen for lack of investment. That's because their innovative applications can only follow a step behind the network's capacity and quality. Networks have a voracious and unending need for capital. Just as no application can safely rest on its laurels, neither can networks. They must constantly be upgraded to satisfy the need for ever-increasing speed, quality, and security. But carriers can only raise capital to invest if they have enough revenues to cover their costs. To raise the necessary revenues, companies need flexibility. They need to be able to adjust their business plans to changing market conditions. Above all, they need to be able to charge for their services and to have the flexibility in doing so. Just as professional application providers cannot afford to give away their content and services for free, neither can the carriers. As an example, the FCC's model forbids Frontier to charge Skype at the wholesale level, even while Skype takes away the voice customers at the retail level from Frontier. If carriers are forced to charge only for broadband access because they can no longer charge for video and voice, the price of that broadband access will increase and investment will fall. That is damaging not only to the carriers, it is also damaging to the application providers that ride on the carriers' networks and are constrained by the capacity and quality limitations of those networks. My concern is that there's a false dichotomy that drives the net neutrality debate, that views the edge as separate from the core, as needing to be protected from the core, as able to prosper only at the expense of the core. In fact, because innovation at the application level is so completely tied to investment and innovation at the transport level, the edge can only exist if the core prospers. The best way to encourage innovation, investment, and jobs at the edge is to also promote innovation, investment, and jobs at the core.
Dr. Kovacs, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. Next is Dr. Shane Mitchell Greenstein, PhD, the Elinor and Wendell Hobbs Professor at the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. Dr. Greenstein, we welcome you. Look forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. I'm happy to share my views with you. Please understand I do not work for anyone, neither firm nor advocate. I come as a professional economist who's had the privilege to study and write about the commercial internet access market, and almost since its inception. From the standpoint of the economics of the internet access market, there are great potential risks from disposing of the open internet order, and the gains from continuity are high. The order looks like good innovation policy and good economic policy. If we want to create a prosperous commercial internet in the next 15 years, think about how well the internet works today. Now think about all the ways it could have gone wrong, and my advice boils down to avoid the same problems we avoided in the past. How do you do that? You keep transactions costs low for entrepreneurs. The United States commercial internet functions well today because it avoids a number of industry practices that would have raised transaction costs of innovation, that would have introduced hassles, delays, and haggling. Instead, today, any entrepreneur can enter without worrying about the gaining the permission of a gateway firm. If the U.S. government commits to no regulatory intervention in internet access markets, would that invite problems? The experience of the last 15 years suggests that there is a risk it will and a chance it will not. It's hard to tell. Until recently, regulatory restraints prevented all carriers from taking certain actions, so there's little experience from which to forecast how carriers would behave in the absence of restraint. One central concern arises due to commercial activities in one line of business, for example, broadband service, affecting the prospects in another, for example, telephony and video entertainment. If carriers act on their economic incentives, we would expect carriers to help all of their businesses, deliberately becoming less transparent to rivals, blocking some content of rivals, or giving lower priority to traffic from erstwhile competitors. Concentrated supply of access in some locations of the United States also heightens the incentives to act this way. A balanced view would also note that there are other factors pushing in the other direction. National standardization processes generate transparency. User tendencies to substitute to alternative carriers in some markets also reduce incentives to block traffic. Reasonable people can differ on the relative importance of these forces, and that is an additional reason why forecasting is hard to make. The dangers would be costly. Any movement towards less transparency and more blocking and more discrimination of traffic introduces hassles and delays for entrepreneurs, software innovators, server companies around the globe, even juniors at Harvard with ambitions to unseat Mark Zuckerberg. Overall, taking away regulatory oversight risks the emergence of a very desirable consequence: less commercial innovation and its child, less economic growth. Policies that tend towards continuity are the most desirable. Continuity here is a regime of continued regulatory presence with occasional and consistent action. It is my view, as it is among many others, that the FCC's policy represents continuity. Frankly, I think broadband firms can live with this rule because it really does not change much of what they do. Entrepreneurs can live with this rule because it lets them innovate and start businesses as easily tomorrow as they did in the past, and raises the certainty that no additional hassles will emerge in the near term. Moreover, the rule includes important and appropriate exceptions for reasonable network management and for the complications of wireless applications. In sum, the potential risks of disproving the rule are great, and the gains from continuity are high, and the order looks like good innovation policy and good economic policy. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for allowing me to testify.
Doctor, thank you for being here. We appreciate your testimony. Now, our final witness this afternoon, Tom DeReggi, President, RapidDSL and Wireless from Boyds, Maryland. We welcome you. You probably came maybe the least distance, I don't know, but certainly not from overseas. Mr. DeReggi, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. It is a great honor to be here today. Quickly about myself, I started reselling DSL, or started outselling DSL. In 2000, I formed RapidDSL and Wireless. My company is a grassroots, independently owned and financed fixed wireless broadband access provider. We cover a 30-mile radius around Washington, D.C., serving businesses and residences in urban and rural communities. I've sat on advisory boards of ISPCon, and until last year, I served on the board of WISPA as Legislative Committee Chairman. Quickly, a bit about WISPs. The WISPs industry is primarily made up of small, independent companies serving both competitive markets and rural markets, many of which would otherwise have no access to broadband at all. The combined services of all WISPs nationwide cover more than 75 million households, 71% of the entire population of the United States. The speed of wireless is determined by topography. In heavily treed areas, a connection may be limited to as little as 3 megabits shared by 50 households, whereas in areas with direct line of sight between towers and customers, speeds as high as 80 megabits are possible. In short, WISPs are real and relevant competition for AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and can reach areas others are unlikely to cover without substantial government subsidies. I'm here today to show my industry support for H.J. Res. 37 and ask Congress to vote to reverse the FCC's recent open internet rules, which are not open and are not neutral. It is my belief that the FCC has overstepped their authority to address a problem that didn't exist at the detriment of our industry and the consumers. If the rules take effect, they will destroy jobs, stifle innovation, deter investment, create uncertainty, distract WISP from building networks to all Americans, increase government spending, create liability, increase legal costs, degrade broadband performance, and increase consumers' price, and possibly put some small WISPs and ISPs out of business. These effects would be contrary to the goals of the FCC's National Broadband Plan. Rules and regulations create jobs only for lawyers. Instead, we need more jobs to expand broadband access to all Americans. Community-based jobs that lead to lifelong careers, locally owned WISPs create that. We don't need regulation band-aids. We need true competitive environments that give consumers choice, foster competition between access providers, and the consequences will be open internet content. Net neutrality regulation is the foundation for monopolies and unnecessary if we build competitive industries. Internet providers need the support from policymakers, not regulatory roadblocks. Uncertainty and liability created by these regulations would be so great that even I, the business owner, have to reconsider whether to continue investing money in my company. The rules apply to broadband as a single uniform product, rather than recognize that two very different, distinct generation broadband products exist: broadband and advanced broadband. is inappropriate to expect first-generation broadband networks providers to allow the operation of second-generation advanced broadband applications, such as HD streaming video, which minimum requirements may exceed the capability or acceptable use policies of the first-generation basic networks. It is inappropriate to insist that broadband access products need to support a user application which the product was not originally designed to support. I believe the term reasonable network management does not go far enough to guarantee that the rules properly match technology to the appropriate access technology. The rules give special consideration to mobile carriers, but inappropriately bundle WISP, fixed wireless providers, to rules intended for wireline and fiber providers. By failing to recognize that WISPs are subject to the same technical constraints as mobile providers, the Commission failed to fulfill its role as an expert agency and instead succumbed to political pressure to pick and choose winners. One size does not work and does not fit all. I wish I could say the Internet was simple, but it's not. The Internet is extremely complicated, and it's different in every community that it's deployed. The Internet is an ever-changing dynamic industry with many variables. I see no way static regulation could ever keep up. The FCC rules address what could happen rather than what actually did happen. For example, ISPs have never censored legal content, but content providers have demonstrated actual anti-competitive behavior. For example, ESPN 360 Disney prevents every one of its ISP customers from accessing its content unless the provider pays it a fixed fee for every customer it has, even though most will not watch the content, and gives favorable rates to large carriers than it gives small providers. This behavior is anything but neutral, but the FCC rules fail to address the serious content neutrality issue. Certainly, if the rules are going to address prospective harms, they ought to address ones that actually already exist. An environment where content providers can be discriminatory is not a neutral network. The rules unjustly entitle consumers and content providers to free reign of someone else's private network at the access provider's expense. Because the rules literally could render an Internet provider's network inoperable, the rules may actually constitute a regulatory taking of the Internet service provider's networks in violation of the Fifth Amendment. The Commission attempts to justify the rules by claiming that they are necessary because many areas are served by only one or two providers. Not only is this assertion false in most cases, but also the rules themselves would make the problem worse by making it more difficult for competitive providers to expand their services. Are WISPs real competition for wired networks such as Comcast? The arithmetic says yes. WiMAX actually delivers more capacity to the end user than most widely deployed cable services which are based on DOCSIS 2.0. A DOCSIS 2.0 hybrid fiber cable system has 43 megabits in downstream direction, 10 megabits upstream at the equipment cabinet that serves a neighborhood. The network is usually engineered so that 500 to 2,000 subscribers are connected by coaxial cable to that cabinet, and the bandwidth divided among them. But in wireless systems using WiMAX or AirMAX technology, each radio has typical capacity of 24 megabits and serves 60 or fewer users. So if all the bandwidth is in use and is divided evenly, each cable subscriber gets 86 kilobits per second, not much more than dial-up, while wireless users get up to 400 kilobit per second. It's a faster network.
Yeah, DeReggi, you've got it. Yeah, exhausted your time, but can you just wrap it up?
Yeah, let me wrap it up. I have pointed out numerous reasons why the FCC Open Internet rules are inappropriate and should be nullified. However, please do not misinterpret this testimony to mean that WISPs or ISPs want to be unfair to their customers or in any way limit their ability to express themselves online. What we want is the freedom and the flexibility to compete, to innovate, and design our networks to provide the services our customers really want. The FCC regulations should take effect will not only fail to do what the Commission claims, they will instead do great harm, preventing us from competing to provide the best services to our customers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to all of you who testified today. We'll go into our questions now, and obviously we're on time constraints here. We each get about 5 minutes, so don't take offense if we ask these in sort of a yes and no environment. Mr. Dingell probably pioneered that on the committee quite successfully. Mr. Turner, do you believe the FCC is on strong legal ground with this order and that it will be upheld in the courts?
I believe they took an unnecessary risk by going down the Title I route.
So you do not believe they're on strong legal ground?
I think they are on less firm legal ground than they could have been.
You oppose the resolution disapproval not because you like the FCC order, you've stated that, but because you think the FCC might lose in court. And when that happens, won't you push for reclassification on Title II? Isn't that your preference?
I oppose the resolution of disapproval because of the consequences of once Congress disapproves of these rules, the FCC is then forbidden from enacting any similar rules in that space that could extend to things far beyond network neutrality, to bill shock, lots of other issues.
But the real issue is that they can't do Title II, right, with this disapproval resolution if it becomes law.
No, I don't believe that. I believe the issue of reclassification is separate from the resolution disapproval, and I do not think reclassification would actually fall under the CRA.
Because in your own documents from Free Press, point number 5, legal footing, it says Janikowski reportedly is grounding these new rules in the same kind of legal arguments that were rejected by the courts last spring. This strategy presents an unnecessary risk in a short-sighted attempt to avoid reclassifying broadband under Title II of the Communications Act. Such a move doesn't just put net neutrality on shaky ground. It places the FCC's entire broadband agenda in jeopardy.
That's exactly right.
So essentially, a vote against this resolution is a vote for reclassification, something that more than 300 members of Congress have opposed in a bipartisan basis. Mr. DeReggi, is it your sense that the larger broadband providers cut a deal that they could live with because it was better than Title II reclassification, but that ultimately you'll be the one having to pay the price, companies like yours? Can you turn on your microphone, sir?
That's correct. The smaller providers and the more competitive providers are the ones that will pay the price for the rules. I agree. I would say that all of us could probably live with the rules if we had to, if they stayed there. The question is they don't necessarily stay there, and the rules don't really give all the protections that are needed for the access providers. Content providers are not the only person on the table to protect here.
And does it give you any concern that the FCC refuses to close its Title II rulemaking? They have that still open. They're taking information on. Isn't that kind of like a little really club hanging out there?
I think this is really an issue that needs to be solved by Congress. So I think the same thing applies to Title II. The Congress should stop that if that were to happen and pass laws that are through the right process.
I would concur. Some of us in this committee believe they don't have the authority of the FCC. It's not been granted by this Congress or any other Congress. Ms. Kovacs, you explained in your statement that networks have a voracious and unending need for capital. Will the net neutrality order hurt the market for capital for network providers? And be sure to turn on your microphone there, ma'am.
Yes, I think that this rule, if it is implemented at all the way it appears likely, is going to be detrimental because it's going to hit at the revenue sources. It's going to make it easier to cannibalize the network providers' revenues. For example, Skype taking Frontier's voice revenues, driving up the cost of broadband by forcing all of the cost on that. So short version, yes, I think it is going to be a problem.
For capital.
For capital.
Ms. Chase, again, thank you for coming, and I would just suggest to the members, too, that she does have to leave sometime this afternoon to catch a flight back, so you may have to depart before we're done with our questions. But despite the fact that these rules have never existed previously, and the companies that you've been involved with and thousands of others have thrived, do I understand correctly that you support these rules because you believe they're needed to ensure that small companies can compete on the Internet?
These rules haven't existed. If we think about Internet and Internet innovation, it doesn't have a very long life. So indeed, the power of the telcos is becoming more and more obvious. And yes, I think it does need protection. And while I didn't have to need that protection when I found it today, we definitely do.
And you've said that without these rules, small companies will get squeezed out by larger companies that can pay for priority on the Internet, in effect.
It's
correct?
Priority. It's also classifying what constitutes the Internet. And if we don't have a definition at the FCC, the telecommunications companies can decide what access actually looks like. So I think I could be separated from my market as well.
And the FCC order itself has said this is not going on today. But, Ms. Chase, you're worried that that might go on in the future, right?
We typically try to protect small interests from duopolies, and I see this as a duopoly, and so it definitely needs some oversight.
So would you be worried if web companies like Google charge websites for prioritized placement on the Internet?
I think the FCC ruling doesn't deal with Google right at this moment. I think it's more talking about infrastructure and access to the internet.
But would you be worried about that? Are
If
you
it
concerned
becomes-
about that? Because somewhere on the end of the pipe, somebody's prioritizing, right?
Yes, I could become worried about that.
And in preparation for this hearing, I did a little search on car share with Google to familiarize myself with the market. And I was pretty surprised to find that my search resulted in a paid placement at the very top of the search list for Zipcar, the company that you founded and ran. So isn't that exactly the kind of issue you're concerned about in terms of a market leader paying an internet giant for better access to consumers?
I would say exact opposite. If we think about the old days of newspapers, where I, as a rich person, could buy a giant full-page ad on a newspaper, and small companies could never afford that, I think that is the parallel that I'd like to draw.
My time's expired, and I will give it to Mrs. Eshu now.
My thanks to all of the witnesses. It's a instructive hearing. First, to Ms. Chase, again, thank you for traveling the distance that you have to be here with us. You're an American entrepreneur, American businesswoman, an innovator. I don't know if my colleagues know this, but Ms. Chase was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people. And so you bring a lot to the table. And I'm especially proud that a woman has achieved what you have. There's a difference at the table. Now, you heard what Dr. Kovacs said. And while I'm not going to, I guess I'll be paraphrasing, she claims that the rules that the FCC adopted would hit revenue sources. Damage capital for investment. Do you want to comment on that? And then I asked Dr. Greenstein to comment on that just very quickly because I have several questions. But would you go to the heart of this whole issue of capital formation, businesses thriving or not thriving, whether the rules are helpful or hurtful, and this attempt to, I think there's a virus here in Congress. And it really is not about net neutrality. I think it's about any kind of regulation and whether government agencies have authority to carry out rules through their regulations. I think that's really what's at the heart of this thing. But at any rate, go ahead.
When we think about the core and whether we're protecting the core of the edges and the symbiosis, the core is a duopoly, and so their investment choices, they have no competitive reason to make good investment choices. I think we can invest in something, or we can cut our costs, we can do more innovations from an operational perspective. There's been an argument that there's only one thing for them to do to improve their system and only one revenue source. There's lots of revenue sources. So I do not buy the argument that just because we're cutting off one particular revenue source that the whole thing crumbles. It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Greenstein?
I disagree strongly with the assertion that all the ISPs in the United States have a problem covering the costs of data. First of all, we should recognize that there are different costs, and there's a large variety. About 15% of the U.S. population lives in low-density areas where it's expensive to run an ISP. Mm-hmm. In the urban populations and in the high-density parts of the United States, we've had a complete build-out, at least by 2 wireline providers. That's what's shown in the National Broadband Plan. Mm-hmm. Those firms are really very healthy. They get margins somewhere estimated between 70 and 90%. That is to say, of the dollar they collect, something like 70 cents to 90 cents on the dollar goes back to capital investment, to the stockholders, to the owners. And then the rest of it covers the costs of their data, the costs of customer maintenance, the cost of service. So given that's the situation, and for 15 years we've been watching the amount of data users ask for go up, I don't really think there's any particular crisis in 85% of the population over how much data the ISPs can handle. It's $1 a month.
I appreciate it. I'm going to
that's fine.
ask you to stop because I want to get a couple of more questions.
Sure,
and,
you get the idea.
To Mr. DeReggi, I mentioned in my opening statement about innovative companies, Netflix and Skype and eBay and how they have flourished, other companies, the thousands of jobs that have been created, not just in my district by constituent companies, but across the country. In your written testimony, you suggest that appropriate network management might be to simply block Netflix altogether. I find that a little chilling. So
I can explain why. I don't believe in blocking.
And will you turn on your microphone?
I don't believe in blocking anything without a
no, but I mean,
reasonable
to block anyone, I think is part of the heart of all of this. So why would you suggest that that an appropriate network management is to block? And then fill in the blank. I mean, you said Netflix, but why do you find that to be, wait a minute, why do you find that to be appropriate? And just real quickly.
Okay. It's appropriate because you block the source of a problem. If the person that's violating your acceptable use policy is Netflix, you block Netflix. It takes less system resources to block them than manage every packet
most
that goes through your
frankly,
network.
I think this is an ineloquent statement about a school of thought. I just don't agree with it, and I think it would be offensive to consumers across the country. But that's my view, and you have yours, so thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kovacs, do you have a response to Ms. Eshu's question?
I'd like to begin by...
Microphone, please. Yeah, it's still not on.
Okay. I'd just like to correct a fact. If you actually look at the margins of the carriers, net income margin is 10% for AT&T and Verizon in 2009, 6% for Frontier. That's as opposed to 28% for Google. So I'm afraid Dr. Greenstein's numbers are the reverse of what he indicated. To go back to the issue of revenues, I think part of what is being missed is that not only are the companies not being allowed to charge for wholesale carriage, so Verizon or Frontier can't charge Skype for carrying Skype. The revenues that are going to get lost are the revenues, voice revenues, that Skype then takes away from Frontier or Verizon or AT&T or the others. And the networks are supported by the core revenues. The cable networks are largely supported by video. The phone networks are largely supported by voice. Broadband right now is treated as incremental. If the core revenues go away, broadband will have to carry it all.
Yeah, I appreciate, I just want to give you that opportunity, but Mr. Cicconi, AT, close. There was a statement made during the opening statements that this rule is necessary because companies like Verizon and AT&T have hindered or blocked or somehow have interfered with the vibrancy of the internet and ingenuity. Can you tell me what policies have existed with AT&T in which you hinder or block the vibrancy of the internet?
Mr. Terry, I don't believe anybody can point to a single instance where AT&T has really done anything of that nature. In fact, I think one can argue that probably no company has made available to consumers more innovations or more choices over the past 5 years than AT&T. The notion that somehow we would have any interest, economic or otherwise, in disadvantaging any of the businesses represented at this table or frankly any other, I think...
How about blocking? That's a major issue here to prevent blocking. How have you blocked access?
We haven't.
You haven't?
We have not.
You have not. All right. Ms. Chase, since you've come so far, I want to make sure we use your time. In your statement, you had mentioned that there was an issue with wireless. Could you tell us, with your previous company, where there were problems with ISPs or backbone or any part that hindered the ability of that company?
The anecdote I gave about starting in 2000, there was a lot of talk about wireless, and it turned out that we were the second application for consumers outside of cell phones. And I was very struck then, and as we think about it today, that the telecommunications industry was lagging behind innovation, yet they were the gatekeepers to how I could buy data packets.
Did they work with you to make sure that
No.
you could?
No, we had to do a workaround for the first 3 years until they offered a different data plan, and it was very arduous. I would also add that in a similar fact, when you manipulate black boxes, as we put into cars, there's a permissions process for that, and that was a 3 to 4 month delay while the telecommunications carrier that we were working with, I think it was Verizon, gave us permission to manipulate the box as they saw fit. And that was also a significant delay for us. So it's better for innovators to not have to ask permission whenever possible.
Would you like to reply? I mean, she did say that was Verizon and not AT&T, but is that a net neutrality issue?
That would have been the point I would have made, Mr. Terry. First of all,
yeah, microphone, please.
I think companies are certainly free to price their services in a competitive market, how they choose to price them, and that may certainly help some companies and hurt others, but that's within their purview in our system. The second point is none of the things cited with respect would be a net neutrality violation, frankly, under any of the proposals that were on the table, including the ones that we rejected pretty strenuously.
All right, my time is up. So I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cicconi, I want to thank you for agreeing to be here today to testify. I know that you and your company have been under pressure to repudiate your past statements about the FCC's open internet order. I understand that AT&T would have preferred no rules in this area. But based on your public statements and conversations with my staff, it's my understanding that you think the FCC landed on a reasonable middle ground that removes the uncertainty that was impeding jobs and investment. Is that an accurate description of AT&T's position?
Yes, sir, it is. We do think it's a reasonable middle ground. I think provided the FCC, as it goes forward, interprets this rule in a narrow way and with appropriate regulatory humility, I think it could also provide the certainty we need in this industry.
Thank you. Your position is very similar to that of the Cable Association. In a letter filed with the committee earlier this week, NCTA CEO Kyle Masclaro stated that the cable industry supports the FCC order because, among other things, it, quote, provides greater certainty about our ability to manage and invest in our broadband services today and those we may deploy in the future, end quote. Professor Greenstein, in looking at the question of whether the FCC should put in place rules to protect the open internet, my staff reached out to a number of prominent economists. They spoke with professors at NYU, Wesleyan, Stanford, Wharton, and USC. All of the economists shared a common belief in competitive markets, and all suggested that unnecessary regulation can undermine efficient markets. But there was also a consensus around the idea that competition in the market for broadband internet access services is limited. Most said this lack of competition made the FCC open internet rules necessary and appropriate. Do you agree?
Yes, I do.
You've said that the open internet rules are essential for growth and innovation of online services. Can you explain?
The access to the internet goes back to the founding of the internet. There's always been a question about who can use it and who has access to the transport level. It goes all the way back to when the NSF net was first privatized. The Congress had to pass an amendment to the NSF charter in order to allow for multiple users. And in terms of the economics, there's always been a question who can use it. The internet is designed, and it has always operated as a network where every user and every potential supplier doesn't have to ask anyone for permission to use it.
And that leads to growth and innovation on online services.
Yeah, it's great for entrepreneurs, even college sophomores at Harvard.
I've heard of one. Saw the movie. Ms. Chase, do you agree? Do you think that open internet rules are essential for growth and innovation of online services?
I absolutely agree, and I think you only have to look at the number of jobs and new companies created over the last 10 years to realize an open internet is the key to our future in America. And I think if we close that down and we don't protect the status quo, which is an open internet, we are putting ourselves in such an anti-competitive position relative to the rest of the world.
Thank you. In addition to reaching out to academics, my staff also spoke with economists at the Department of Justice, and we wanted to speak with DOJ to get their reaction to the argument, often repeated here, that the issue of net neutrality is better addressed through antitrust enforcement. DOJ told us that that's not the case. Although antitrust can be useful if a phone or cable company uses its market power to stop a competitor from entering the market, antitrust law doesn't stop a phone or cable company from blocking websites or applications that don't pay for access. According to DOJ, favoring websites that pay high fees and degrading websites that don't is perfectly legal under the antitrust laws, as long as a phone or cable company isn't in direct competition with the websites being degraded. I don't know who to direct this to, but let me ask you, Mr. Greenstein, do you agree that antitrust laws are not sufficient to protect the public against attempts by the phone and cable companies to take advantage of their market power?
Yeah, antitrust laws are very good for looking at mergers, but at very narrow questions in mergers. That's principally what they're about.
And anybody on the panel disagree with the DOJ position?
Mr. Waxman, I very much agree with Justice on this. There are numerous problems in the marketplace that antitrust will not govern. Further, the limited selection of problems that antitrust would govern has been weakened by the Supreme Court's Trinco case. So therefore, antitrust is really no remedy at all to consumers or producers in this case.
Thank you very much. Yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray. Is that Mr. Bilbray? Okay. The gentleman yields to the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Chase, I wanted to come to you. Your testimony seems a little disconnected to me, and so I was hoping that you could help clear up a couple of things for me, unless I'm missing something. You set up a very successful company using the internet as it was, basically the status quo internet, and you did that without a whole lot of trouble. Is that right?
I wouldn't say without a whole lot of trouble at all, but yes.
Well, you didn't have to overcome horrific odds or anything. You worked your business plan, set it up, and got it in place. So now I hear you saying that what you're wanting to do is to preserve the net neutrality rules that the FCC moved forward on. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you're saying you want to do that so that edge companies like yours can innovate, like your current company can innovate. But see, I look at this and I think the internet without net neutrality rules has worked great for innovators. And now you're wanting to change the rules. So why should the FCC's rules allow you to innovate and then not other entrepreneurial companies like maybe Mr. DeReggi's over here?
I would say that I would like to see the FCC rules preserve the status quo that existed when I was doing that innovation. And
Ma'am, there was no federal governance of the internet. Mr. DeReggi, do you have a comment on that?
Well, you know, I think you pretty much summed it up with your statement.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you this. I have a very rural part of my district, Perry, Wayne, Hickman County, where I was last week. They are very concerned about broadband. So speak to me what you think is going to happen with broadband investment. These communities need it for education and for economic development. So what should their expectation be?
Most likely, people aren't going to spend their money if they're not going to get a return on it. I think what people need to realize is that the cost to deploy difficult areas to get broadband is much higher than the cost to deploy broadband to to the mass easy areas.
Let me ask you this then. Do you have any idea what the magnitude of jobs loss would be for these areas that are underserved or sparsely populated and can't get it?
Well, it's going to astronomical, but it's also going to lead to the population leaving to other areas.
Okay. Mr. Turner wanted to come to you for a minute. I was sitting here looking through everything. Now, Mr. Cicconi, we know he's with AT&T, Mr. DeReggi with RapidDSL, Ms. Chase with Buzzcar. So we know what interests that they are representing, and it's less clear to me whom you represent with Free Press. And I think it might be instructive to us as we read your testimony and as we try to figure out, you know, the bias that you bring to the argument, if you could detail to us where Free Press gets its funding.
Certainly. Do you want me to do that now or in writing?
I would love to do it now, and if you want to submit for us the 10 largest supporters of Free Press, I think that'd be great. It'd be instructive.
Free Press takes zero corporate money. We are completely supported by our members and by foundation support.
Okay, and then will you submit your funding?
Absolutely. I'd be pleased to, yes.
All right, that would be great. I would appreciate that, and with that, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Cicconi, thank you for being here and walking this tightrope that you are here today. Let me just begin. I heard you say that you feel that the regulations that were promulgated are a fair middle ground. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you also testified that as the rules have now been promulgated, that it is going to require no change in the business plans of AT&T. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're also testifying that it is creating a longer-term, predictable investment environment for AT&T. Is that also correct?
It's correct, again, provided that the FCC continues to interpret the plain language of the rule in a narrow way, and again, I'd hope with appropriate regulatory humility.
But at this point, you have identified that appropriate level of humility. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people to hear. Okay, is there a problem, or is there something here that we are trying to cure that actually does not exist? Because obviously, before August of 2005, the non-discrimination principles were there, and the internet grew, expanded for years until that ruling in 2005. So all of these companies, Google, eBay, Hulu, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, all were able to be founded in that non-discriminatory era. Ms. Chase, from an entrepreneur's perspective, you're here representing thousands and thousands of smaller companies out there now looking at this decision or this potential resolution that the Republican majority is thinking of promulgating. What do you think would be the impact in terms of how the venture capital industry, other investors will now view these thousands of companies that are in this space trying to innovate using the internet?
If the venture capitalists think that I can't compete because I can't pay for special access or I might be stymied by special rules, clearly they wouldn't invest in us.
Okay, and how many companies are in this space? I don't mean competing against Zipcar, but I'm talking just the companies that are dependent as smaller startups.
We know if we think about innovation and job creation, we know that startups are the ones that have created all the jobs in the last 10 years, or 75% of them. So I would say significant numbers of them.
Okay, now, this hope that the antitrust laws could be used, if you're Zipcar, how long would it take and how much would it cost Zipcar to use the antitrust process? And what is the likelihood that your vindication would be posthumous from a corporate perspective if a court ultimately did render a favorable decision?
You've made a very good point that without a body such as the FCC to whom I can turn, who can protect me, as a small business, you never sue anybody. You can never enter into that at all.
Right, and I agree with that. That's a false promise, false protection, because the antitrust law is clearly for smaller companies, and 80% of all new jobs in America are created by smaller companies, and a disproportionate number of them are now created by companies dependent upon the internet. So that's where our job creation comes from. And this is a huge decision that the Republicans are now making, intervening into a marketplace where AT&T says they can live with the rules, Comcast says they can live with the rules, and the smaller internet companies are all saying that they can live with the rules. Mr. Turner, when you were just asked who do you represent, could a simple explanation of who you represent just be the consumer?
We are a public interest advocacy group concentrated on the interests of consumers. Yes,
on the consumers, thank you. Now, why don't you just expand a little bit on what the impact of a repeal of these non-discriminatory principles could mean for consumers in the United States?
It could be devastating. Right now, I think through Mr. Cicconi's testimony, we've learned that there's really no problem the marketplace has with the FCC rules. However, if you remove that certainty, you then create potential discrimination against innovative companies like Mrs. Chase. You potentially have companies that would block content like Netflix because it competes with their online video products. You potentially have the next Netflix, the next Zipcar, not being able to start their business, and consumers ultimately are the losers in that.
So if you are a kid in a dorm someplace and you've got an idea right now and your girlfriend is over at the business school and she says, maybe I can help you to raise some money right now, what is the difference in terms of the perspective of an investor if you have discrimination or non-discrimination principles on the books in terms of the startup of a small business that would ultimately provide consumers with more choice?
Well, it would create tremendous uncertainty, and I think we keep hearing, that there was never network neutrality to begin with, but I think that's really an inaccurate view of history. The internet was born from the principle of non-discrimination. It existed for the 30 years before it even became commercialized, and it existed, as you mentioned, until 2005. It wasn't until that recent change that this got started.
Let me just finish on that point. And that was the testimony that we had here from Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. He made it quite clear that when he created the World Wide Web, he baked the principle of non-discrimination into the personality of the internet. He invented the World Wide Web. He's still only 54 years old. And that was the first witness that we had 4 years ago before the committee. So we can either give some deference to the inventor of the World Wide Web, which is the basis for all of this commercial activity, or we can just ignore it. But non-discrimination, he testified, was the central characteristic of the web. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to ask some questions to the panel, and especially to have us focusing on this issue, this new government regulation of the internet, net neutrality, and especially as we deal with the legislation later on today. I kind of amazed at some of the comments I'm hearing from not only some people on the panel, but some of my colleagues on the other side. I'm a computer science major, and I've watched as this industry has thrived probably more than any other industry in the world. And it's thrived because the government hasn't figured out how to regulate it, how to mess it up. And yet you've got now a rule coming in by the FCC, this new net neutrality, where the government's coming in and saying, we're going to fix the internet. We're going to come in with regulations to fix the internet. Because, boy, if you look all across this country, all the problems our country's facing, if the president really was focused on what the real problems of the country are, he'd be focused on creating jobs. And if you want to go and find a good template of how to create jobs, go look at the internet. Go look at these great innovative companies. Go look at these great innovators who dropped out of college and are now billionaires because the federal government hadn't figured out how to regulate in a way that somebody can do just that, can innovate in a way that Ms. Chase and so many others have innovated. And so now you've got the FCC coming in and saying, we're going to regulate, and people are actually saying, it's good that the FCC is regulating it to keep the status quo. Well, first of all, it's the other format, the non-regulated format that allowed all of this innovation. That's still to this day, by the way, it's not over. Unfortunately, with the FCC's coming in, there is a big concern in industry of the people who actually invest billions of dollars. And I want to ask you, starting off, Mr. Cicconi, your company is one of the many companies who's invested tremendously. We had testimony a few weeks ago from the FCC. All 5 FCC commissioners came before us talking about this new regulation of the internet, net neutrality. And we heard testimony from one commissioner, nobody disputed it, that over $500 billion of investment has been made to build the broadband infrastructure that exists today that allows all this innovation. And none of that was taxpayer money, by the way. Maybe that's one of the things that this administration doesn't like. It all happened with private investment. How much money has your company invested in allowing this innovation and creating and building this network infrastructure?
I don't have an exact figure in front of me, Mr. Scalise, but last year we invested approximately $19 billion in capital. I think.
How much is that? Can you say that again?
$19 billion in capital in the United States. Nearly all of that was in the United States, and I think that was more than any other American company invested in the United States last year.
And that was under non-net neutrality rules.
Correct. And this year we'll invest roughly between $17 and $19 billion in capital again.
And let me ask you this, because in your statement, I listened to your testimony, and you used a number of comments that I thought were interesting. And you know, some people act as if you're really thrilled about net neutrality, and maybe some people are thrilled about it. But in your statement, you said all of this without any real evidence of a problem. It's still AT&T's strong preference to have no regulation. The proposal was extreme and upset the financial markets. You're talking about earlier proposals, and then ultimately you said the only proposals before us were either bad or worse. So here you've got the government coming in and saying, okay, first of all, there is no problem. The innovation has never been greater, and no industry in the history of the world has seen this much innovation. And so now the government's going to come in and regulate it, but they're going to give you some options, and we're going to give you a bad option and a worse option. Well, anybody would say, well, I guess I'll take the bad option instead of the worse option. And that, to some people on the other side, constitutes you supporting this new regulation of the Internet. So I just want to put it in that context, but ask you, you know, because you expressed this as a concern, there's an assumption by some that the FCC is going to interpret these rules in a very narrow way. What if the FCC does not interpret these rules in a narrow way, which if we're not able to pass our legislation to block the regulation, the FCC would be free to interpret it as broadly as they'd like? What if they don't interpret the rules narrowly?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstance, sir. You know, clearly we would reserve the right to challenge that in court if something were to occur that we feel is inconsistent with the plain language of the rule.
And I'm sure some people would think that's good to have now companies that innovate, that add $17 billion of their own capital to build out the infrastructure, are now concerned about maybe having to go to court to be able to continue innovating. Let me ask you, Ms. Chase, and you know, appreciate you coming here from France to participate in this. When I did, as the chairman of the subcommittee did, a Google search on car sharing, your company that you founded, Zipcars, came up. Is there anything in this FCC ruling that prohibits you from being able to buy that premier placement under net neutrality, where a startup wouldn't have that same advantage?
I feel like that's not the question at hand.
Well, that is the question at hand. The bottom line is, you know, maybe you don't want to answer it because you're given now a monopoly. You're now given an advantage over the new startup. I'm not as concerned about the companies that are already successful today that being able to innovate as much as the new company, the new idea that we will be blocking from innovating. And maybe you would like the idea because under net neutrality, Google's still able to give you preference over the new startup that now is at a competitive disadvantage because of net neutrality. So I would hope you would not only be concerned about your company's success, but also the new startup company that's going to be as innovative as yours.
Gentleman's time is expired.
And I yield back my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses today. It's amazing. Maybe sometimes we just don't speak clearly enough. You know, up till 2005, the transmission component of DSL service was regulated as a telecommunications service. In the dial-up world, companies provided data transmission. They were obviously regulated as a telecommunications service because the data traveled over phone lines. So, you know, to keep hearing statements that you know, there was never any regulation of the Internet and it worked just peachy keen, it just isn't based in any reality. Dr. Kovacs, I was interested in your testimony. I hear you say that we can't take care of the edge at the expense of the core, and that you feel that that these rules that the FCC have put forward would stifle investment in this. Are you aware of the analysis done by the Bank of America and Merrill Lynch?
I'm not, no.
They came to a different conclusion. How about Citibank, that called this FCC ruling balanced? They came to a different conclusion to you. Do you know that Wells Fargo, in their analysis of these rules, called it a light touch, and that Raymond James also disagrees with your analysis? It seems to me that you're somewhat of an outlier in the field with regards to whether or not this stifles investment in the field. Let me ask Dr. Greenstein. You've looked at the literature on this and did a literature review. What did you find in your review of the literature was the consensus on the FCC order and its impact on investment?
It largely doesn't change the practices at most ISPs. We all went home tomorrow. The business would look the same as it did a year ago.
Thank you. Mr. DeReggi, first of all, I want to say I appreciate your company and the competition that it provides in areas that need it. And I know it's hard for entrepreneurs to come up to this committee and provide testimony and engage in policy matters. So I appreciate the fact that you're here. But I'm a little confused by some of the things that you've said. And on prior occasions, you've expressed support for open internet principles, specifically in comments that you made to the NTIA and RUS in response to the second round of BTOP funding. You stated that RapidDSL fully endorsed the comments of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. And among those association's comments, it argued that the agency should make clear to any funding recipient that they will agree to abide by the rules the FCC adopts in its ongoing network neutrality proceedings. So I guess my question is, since you agree with applying the FCC's rules to funding recipients, why would you support a wholesale rejection of the rules through a resolution like this?
Great question, and because the government was paying for the network, not me. Also, I do support an open internet. The net neutrality rules passed by the FCC is not an open, neutral policy. It's a policy that favors content providers and gives them discriminated rights and does not allow those same rights for access providers.
Let me ask you this one. Also, you sent an email to then the FCC Chairman Kevin Martin regarding Comcast blocking your traffic. And your quote was to Chairman Martin, quote, "War on Comcast is a necessary war. It sets the precedent that these net neutrality blocking won't expand as a strategic advantage to harm competitors," end quote. You've also expressed support for RapidDSL being subject to rules related to truth in advertising or disclosure of your network management practices. You said that in an ex parte letter to Chairman Janikowski. I guess what confuses me is if you're in support of some of these FCC rules, such as transparency requirement, why do you want to see the Congressional Review Act be used to invalidate all of the FCC's rule? Wouldn't you at least prefer Congress to take a more surgical approach to, deal with those things that trouble you, but not throw the entire rules out?
Oh, they don't deal with any of the things that troubled us. So we're a provider too. We're there. Just protecting our competition doesn't help us.
And thank you.
All the claims that I've asked help for, we haven't got that help. The rules don't give us protection.
But you're here to support a practice that's going to throw all of this out. That which you agree with, as well as those things that you have a problem with. Mr. Turner, your testimony, I want to, you don't support this resolution. You basically think the FCC didn't go far enough. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yes, sir.
And Ms. Chase, I just want to say, I see zip cars all over Pittsburgh. That's the area that I represent, and I think it's really a fantastic service, and people use it a lot in Pittsburgh. Just as a entrepreneur and an innovator and a job creator, you're here and you've come a long way to do that. We're policymakers up here. So what's the one thing that you'd like to share with all the policymakers up here with regards to the internet? What do you think Congress should be doing?
We've talked a lot about the stymieing that this is promoting and will prevent investment for the core. And there was a figure here that was thrown out of $19 billion that Verizon is intending to, AT&T, sorry, is intending to invest. I'd like to point out that the small business contribution to the economy is vastly, vastly larger than any of that. And we're talking about throwing out rules that protect those small businesses from lawsuits that we can't have, antitrust suits that we can't go after. And I'd also like to suggest that Mr. DeReggi's fears is he represents a small businessman, and he is also being crushed by the duopoly and their advantages. So it comes back to this duopoly control of access to the internet and not about what happens on the internet. The internet itself is inherently open if we can get there.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to have the panel. We appreciate all the effort to be here. This is what I've always struggled with, and I think I'm going to open up with really Ms. Chase, because I think all of us appreciate a business model that people have an idea of a service that's not being rendered. That's an idea. You all have to develop a business plan, and then you go to the markets to raise money. You're assuming risk. Hopefully somewhere down the road there's a return. That's the way the business works. That's the capitalist system. It's great. It's thriving. It's why we have one of the greatest economies in the world, even in a down time. Why doesn't this work for, let me ask this question this way. If the FCC can control the pipeline by picking winners and losers of intervention, what is the market signal to build out more pipes?
I don't think the FCC is controlling the pipeline to pick winners and losers.
Okay, let me ask this question again. And I'm not trying to pick a fight. I'm saying, where is the market signal if we want to build out more pipes? If there is a government agency that then can say, bad boy, bad girl. Usually if there's a constrained supply, the market would say you can pay a premium for access. Eventually the market signal would be what? Build out another pipe, just like, and you've made these decisions in your whole business plan, and that's the way the system. So my question is, what's the market signal that would encourage build out of more pipes? Because what's the better answer instead of government regulation? The better answer is build more pipes.
I think there's a variety of answers, and build more pipes might be one of those answers, but I also think that it's only you.
It's the only market answer. I mean, it's the only answer in a competitive market that then private capital would flow to build it. Now we have an example of government trying to intervene in building this and the stimulus, and we found out that we overbuilt, we incentivized government-run. We didn't. We have unserved, underserved areas. The stimulus is an example, a perfect example of how we failed by providing government money to do what the market should do. So let me go. I've got 2 minutes left, and I want to ask Mr. Cicconi. I hope I pronounced that right. The FCC says that these rules bring certainty to the broadband economy, and certainty in the business model is very, very important. It lowers. If you got certainty, you have lower risk. You can borrow more capital, or the cost of capital is less. That's true, right?
Correct.
Isn't the uncertainty that the FCC cured originally caused by the FCC?
I couldn't
Was that unfair?
No, I don't think so, Mr. Shimkus. I clearly, and I think I reflected this in my opening statement, that I think this rule is a fair and middle ground, but certainly that's fair in comparison with the alternatives that we were facing.
That's great, and I want to end up with Mr. DeReggi, and I appreciate your testimony, and they highlight your background, and again, I see a segue to market principles is the best way to provide goods and services to individuals. But do you believe it is equitable that these rules apply to you but not web companies?
I find that to be a tragedy that they apply solely to us and not web companies.
Do you agree with the letter we received from the NCTA, the cable folks, that drawing these types of distinctions between broadband providers and web companies no longer makes sense?
I would agree.
Great. And Mr. Chairman, I'm finished. Thank you for time. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I thank the witness for being here today. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing prior to any markup on such an important issue, although I still have reservations regarding the process in which this resolution is moving. There are far too many unanswered questions to resolve that will undoubtedly lead to unintended consequences on the market. That being said, I strongly oppose this resolution because it undermines market certainty, harms consumers, discourages innovation, investment, and job creation in this country, and does nothing to move our nation's economy forward. Mr. Cicconi, it's no secret that over the years, AT&T has raised concerns over proposed net neutrality rules. Yet, AT&T took a stance in support of the FCC's order as its CEO and chairman earlier this year that the open internet order ended at a place where we have a line of sight and we know we can commit to investments. What are the specific factors that lead you to supporting the FCC's order?
As I said earlier, Ms. Matsui, I think we're comfortable with the order primarily because it walks this line, we feel, in a more balanced way than the other proposals that were in front of the FCC. I think keep in mind that the two proposals that were there, one was an NPRM that frankly had a discrimination standard in it that we felt was probably a violation of the Telecom Act and certainly didn't have support in the Act. Would have inevitably led to legal challenge. And the other was to impose common carriage regulation on these services again, which would have been, I think, a very extreme proposal. We were pleased that the FCC was willing to work with us to try and deal with our concerns and, frankly, deal with the concerns of stakeholders to see if there was a middle ground. Like any middle ground, we're not happy with every part of it. We'd have preferred some different language and different standards. We'd have preferred nothing on wireless.
Right. Understand that. We've heard from a great number of leading economists in support of the FCC's order. Assuming that the FCC moves forward with the order to ensure rules of the road are in place to protect innovators and consumers, what impact does CRA have on Wall Street?
I think that's tough to predict, Ms. Matsui, primarily because I think if the CRA were to pass, I think the ball then passes to the FCC, and I think the market reaction would depend heavily on how the FCC then reacted. If the FCC, for example, reacted by deciding that it didn't want to move forward with any further regulations in this area, obviously I think the market would be pleased and that would provide a high degree of certainty. If, on the other hand, the FCC reacted by going back to the still open Title II proceeding and began that process all over again that we went through this past year, I think it would create a great deal of uncertainty. So I think the answer to that really rests with the FCC. It doesn't really, it's not really a product of the CRA and what the Congress decides to do on that. It's really more a product of what the FCC decides to do in the wake of that.
Okay, but you're still dealing with uncertainty, though.
Potentially, but again, depending on what the FCC decides to do.
Okay. The FCC Open Internet Order includes a meaningful transparency requirement so that consumers and innovators have the information they need to make informed choices. I should mention that this transparency rule was widely supported by all industry stakeholders and deemed non-controversial. If this resolution becomes law, the FCC's transparency rule, which simply states that broadband providers must disclose their network management practices, performance characteristics, and terms and conditions of the broadband service to consumers, will be eliminated. That would be bad for consumers, bad for business, and bad for the internet economy. I have a question for the panel, and I'd like a yes or no answer, just a yes or no answer. Do you support the FCC's sixth principle on transparency, which will provide consumers, small businesses, and innovators with the information they need to make informed choices? I'll start with you, Mr. Turner.
Yes.
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 Okay, thank you for your answer. The FCC order includes a meaningful transparency requirement, which this whole panel seems to agree should be in place. As our economy continues to evolve and new emerging economic sectors are growing, a free and open internet will be vital, one that acts as a framework for industry to follow to ensure all stakeholders are playing by one rule. Ms. Chase, you're a leading entrepreneur who relies on the internet to conduct businesses. Using your experience, how will the FCC open internet order impact emerging new economic sectors like smart grid and health IT, among others?
I think it'll have an enormous impact, and that's one of the things I'm concerned about.
Okay, thank you. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the Chairman of the Oversight Committee and the former Chairman of this committee, Mr. Stearns, for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I listened to the testimony of Mr. Waxman and Mr. Markey, and Mr. Cicconi. They have praised you as supporting the FCC approach to rulemaking, and Mr. Markey has praised you, and Mr. Waxman, I think other Democrats. I know that must put you in a little awkward position, having been the ranking member of this committee and working with you and all the consumer groups as well as others trying for months to try and work this out and realizing how difficult it was. And then reading through your testimony, I think maybe this will clear it up for Mr. Waxman and Mr. Markey a little bit. The chairman of your company, Randall Stevenson, summed up his reaction to the FCC. This is in your opening statement, his decision. And I thought I'd read it because it really, I think, goes to the point and perhaps gets you off the hot seat here, because he's speaking for your company. And he said, we would be lying if we said we were pleased with the approach. But it's a place we know we have. We didn't get everything we'd like to have. But I'd like to have had no regulation. That was his point. I'd like to have had no regulation, to be candid. So, you know, Mr. Waxman and Mr. Markey are saying that you folks are just out there touting this approach. I think your chairman has pointed out that if he had his druthers, he'd like to have no regulation. Is that still accurate in your opinion?
That's absolutely accurate, Mr. Stearns. I think this entire debate for many years, but certainly for the past 2 years, has revolved around a very difficult question, which is should one regulate to deal with hypothetical problems?
Right.
Because by and large, that's what we're dealing with is hypotheticals, and it's the hardest thing, I think, for policymakers to decide. And if you move into this space, it's very, very hard to draw lines. And this is one of the things that worries us the most about moving into this area. It was stated earlier that different members of the internet ecosphere might be regulated in a different fashion. Some regulated, some not. And inevitably, the danger there is, of course, the government gets into picking winners and losers. And our concern, of course, is not only with that, but with the fact that the government doesn't do this very well.
Yeah. Dr. Kovacs, in looking through your testimony, the aspect about your opening statement, we talked about the transfer of wealth from broadband internet access providers to application providers is accurate, but you say it does not seem to grasp the problem for both parties. So you say it provides those who ride the network with a strategically vital financial weapon to use against broadband internet access, who in many cases are their competitors. To put it in another way, it takes all bargaining power away from the BIA. You might just confirm that, what you mean.
A couple of different things. For example, one of the things the FCC did not look at is a situation in which Google might decide to withhold its services from Verizon in Boston, but continue to provide them to Comcast, which would, I think, become a huge problem for Verizon retaining customers. The revenues that are taken away from the voice provider, who's also a broadband provider like Frontier, by Google Voice, Skype, Vonage, all of those represent a transfer of wealth, and they become problematic for Google and et cetera if that means that the network cannot continue to innovate. And I think, to me, the really troubling piece of this discussion is the assumption that only the companies at the edge, like Robbins, need to innovate, but that Mr. DeReggi doesn't. And in fact, she won't be able to do her business unless he keeps investing.
Mr. DeReggi, have you actually read the FCC's approach to this net neutrality? I mean, have you or your staff actually taken time to read it? Yeah. What's specifically in there that you don't like? I mean, can you tell the committee maybe some specifics about it?
Yeah, the thing that I don't like about it most is that it's everything's double standard. It does half the problem. For example, I want consumers to have their choice of content, but it doesn't really give that. You know, right.
So it's
right.
it's vague
right.
in areas you think it should be precise. Would that be?
Right. Exactly. It's also very vague. So because of it, it allows it to be interpreted by the person who just happens to be in the office at that specific time, who could have a completely different viewpoint of what those terms mean.
And because it's vague in this point, does it create uncertainty to you in terms of investment?
A tremendous amount of uncertainty. I just don't know what to expect.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers, for 5.
Mrs. Kovacs, the FCC claims that the order brings certainty to the market. I'm having a hard time finding where the uncertainty was, except for the fact that the FCC was talking about intervening in the market. Doesn't a lawsuit over the FCC's lack of authority bring even more uncertainty into the market?
The issue is definitely not settled at this point because of the possibility for litigation and because of the point that Mr. Cicconi made that we're not going to know what the rules mean until the FCC interprets them one by one. So companies right now really have no idea of what they can do in terms of pricing, in terms of the kind of products they can develop as part of their business plan on the carrier side until a sort of case law develops at the FCC.
And that never happens in a hurry.
Well, no.
And that's
the whole. I mean, that's.
So now we've added another layer of uncertainty to the definitive uncertainty that the FCC put into the market in the first place. A little confusing to me. We're just a small construction company back in Michigan. We don't maybe a little beyond our intellectual prowess to understand how we got to the uncertainty in the first place. Ms. Chase, thanks for being here today. I'm really interested in your business model. When you negotiate a parking space, say in Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, is that something the company pays for? Is it something that the city gives you? How does that work?
That's a jurisdiction by jurisdiction thing. It's typically done through an RFP.
Right, so you compensate on most cases, or are they given to you in most cases?
I can't speak for what's happening today, and I couldn't give that count, but I have paid for municipal parking spaces.
Yeah. And so you took advantage, basically. It's a good business model. I think it's a smart business model, but you took advantage of the concrete and the curb paid for by taxpayers. You negotiate a much lower rate, and the only reason I say that, I've driven by those spaces and looked with envy as I've been around the block 16 times trying to park my car. So what you've done is you've utilized taxpayer-funded support networks, the infrastructure. You've utilized that park, taken it off the market for the rest of the taxpayers who paid for it, and for this service business model. I think it's clever, don't get me wrong, but you can clearly see that you're taking advantage of that particular spot based on someone else's investment, mainly the taxpayer. And I find it interesting because I know you got several millions of dollars to help you start your company from the federal government. And the argument being, I think we found $6.5 million to date on earmarks to Zipcar. And I do believe the figure's larger than that at the end of the day. So, but here, let me make my point, and then I'll certainly get your response. So you understand why I think advocacy is important and why we should understand advocacy and why people take position. I mean, your company did well. It was certainly helped financed by the federal government. You're taking advantage of taxpayers by using their infrastructure and making money off it. Hey, if you get away with it, God bless you. I'm for it. It's capitalism. But now you're saying we want to do the same thing to the internet. We want the government to come in to protect me so I don't have to pay for the expansion of the internet that we know should happen based on hopefully what we see as increased volume and more businesses coming into the internet. And so that's the part that I find confusing about your advocacy is that, I mean, you're clearly your business model heavily weighted on subsidies, especially by taxpayers.
Let me just correct a couple things. I was CEO for the first 3 years, and the first 3 years we took absolutely zero government dollars. As to parking spaces, parking is grotesquely underpriced everywhere. Citizens park for free on street generally, and if you were to rent that parking space, it would be $3,000 a month. So it is certainly by no means, I would feel it was uncompetitive that we had to compete with free on-street parking given to residents, and we could not access that.
I'm not sure where the free on parking is, but you ought to try putting the quarters in. You better bring about 8,000 pounds of quarters in Washington, D.C. But I will just say...
So this is not the argument, but to this other piece, so I do not think at all that we have sucked at the government tit in any case. I would say, though, that when I look at market, I have written here that market signals are driven by demand and by competitive pressures, and we can look to what we were talking about, which is that the access to an open internet is gated by two major companies. They may be responding, the market signals might be working for demand, but they're not responding
I'm running out of time.
competitive pressures.
I hear your point, but you said something interesting. You said if you can get there, and I completely agree with you. On-ramps and off-ramps are incredibly important. My fear is, and Mr. DeReggi, if you can follow up on this, if we have now purposely, because the government now comes in and makes everything nice in theory, and they decide who wins and who loses, why on God's green earth would you invest in new on-ramps and off-ramps for the internet? And Mr. DeReggi, could you just answer that? I see my time is almost up.
Right. Well,
very quickly.
I pretty much fully agree with you. Not quite sure to answer it because I agree with what you've said.
But on-ramps and off-ramps are important to companies like yours, are they not?
On-ramps and off-ramps are definitely important to our company.
And does this not stifle AT&T and Verizon from investing in new on-ramps and off-ramps?
It definitely does, yes.
Thank you. Now that on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. Recognize Mr. Barrow for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I would like to yield my time to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo.
I thank the gentleman for yielding his time to me very, very much. First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a unanimous consent request that the following items be entered into the record. A letter to the committee from numerous faith-based organizations, a letter to the committee from Consumers Union, a letter to the committee from Consumer Federation of America, a survey conducted by Consumers Union and Consumer Federation of America, a letter to the committee from the Mountain Area Information Network, known as MAIN, an editorial from the LA Times, an editorial from the New York Times, and an editorial from USA Today.
Without objection, each of those items have been reviewed by the majority and they will be entered into the record.
Thank you very, very much. It's been said that there isn't any reason for the FCC to have developed these rules of the road, and that we are operating in theory. That's not correct, and I don't think that can stand on the record. The Open Internet Order was a reaction to specific abuses designed to prevent future problems. I mean, those are the facts. This is not theory. This isn't something that we made up. In 2005, Madison River Communications blocked VoIP on its DSL network. It was settled by FCC's consent decree that included a $15,000 payment. In 2006, Singular blocked PayPal after contracting with another online payment service. In 2007, Comcast initially denied and then admitted, after an FCC complaint was filed, that it blocked peer-to-peer traffic. Comcast subsequently changed its practices, and the FCC directed Comcast to disclose its network management practices and enjoined it from blocking VoIP. In 2008, Max Planck Institute released a study finding significant blocking of BitTorrent in the United States, including efforts by Comcast and Cox. In 2009, RCN entered in a class action settlement agreement in which it acknowledged it blocked, degraded, or slowed P2P apps. In 2009, AT&T blocked use of iPhone VoIP applications that used 2G or 3G, and in 2010, AT&T blocked use of the Slingbox iPhone application on a 3G network. So we're not operating out in the ether somewhere, and neither is the FCC. So I think it's important to set those things down for the record. I'd also like to make an observation, and again, thank the chairman for having this legislative hearing. What I've heard today is consumers believe that we should not be proceeding with the CRA, and that there is a very important set of standards, light by standard by the FCC, that really should be put into place. We've heard from one of the 100 of Time Magazine's most influential persons in our country, maybe in the world, Ms. Chase, say that this is not menacing to innovators, that this is helpful and that it's important. Dr. Kovacs, you're the only one that I really don't get here in terms of your theory of economics. But Mr. Cicconi, I appreciate the fact that you would come, that you would accept our invitation and say what you have said and stand where you are standing. I've had disagreements, policy disagreements with AT&T, but we see where Comcast, where AT&T, where small entrepreneurial businesses, as well as consumer organizations, as well as economists, all weighing in and saying that these rules are not menacing. In fact, what is menacing is this CRA. So I'm glad that we've had this legislative hearing, because it's cast even a brighter light on what the committee is considering doing following this legislative hearing. I'm grateful to all of you, even those whose views I don't entirely either understand or embrace, but that's what makes for a great hearing. And I think that this has been, and I will, right there, almost on the money, used my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. For the witnesses' edification and for the committee, we're in the middle of a vote right now, so we will recess. We'll recess now and resume the hearing immediately thereafter. Now, I know some of you may have to depart. I understand that. Our committee members will probably submit some questions for the record then, for those of you who have to leave. Those who don't, we will reconvene, and then after we're done with the round of questions, the final round here, we will then recess briefly so the room can be reset, and we'll go right into the markup. And so I would welcome you all to stay around who can, and we'll be back after the vote. With that, the committee stands in recess.
Stick around.
I don't know how many are up. I don't know. I don't have my BlackBerry. I don't know how many up.